What's going on, guys? It's Danny from Fantasy Stock Exchange here, and today I'll be going through my Week 13 wide receiver rankings in a tier list format, like you guys would have saw from last week. My top 40 wide receivers overall, broken down by whether they're elite, a wide receiver one, a wide receiver two, 3 type, or a potential wide receiver three this week going into fantasy football. And I get it, you guys are probably used for the majority of the season that we were doing the game by game analysis, but going to be honest, everybody was kind of saying it's kind of getting stale. They wanted to see a refreshing angle to attack our wide receiver position. So that's what we've done these last few weeks. So if you enjoyed this type of format, make sure you leave a like down below. 150 likes is the goal. But today, as I kind of said, we're going to go through my top 40 wide receiver rankings. I'm going to cover the same stuff as usual, wide receiver cornerback matchups, spreads, matchup implications, stuff like that to get you guys full ready for your week 13 matchups. As I say on every video, hopefully you guys secure the dub this week, secure your playoff spot entering your 2023 playoffs. But before we get into the video, as always, we're going to hit the intro. All right, before I get into the official tier by tier rankings, here is the matchup chart for week 13 entering fantasy football. As you guys know, a composite of adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, rank in pass defense DVOA, and rank in PFF coverage grade. So on the far right, you guys basically see what the weighted average would look like. And the easiest matchups of the week happen to be Deontay Johnson and George Pickens going up against the Atlanta Falcons, Christian Kirk going up against the Detroit Lions, and Keenan Allen and Josh Palmer going up against that Las Vegas Raiders secondary. On the flip side, the toughest matchups of the week happen to be Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen going up against the New York Jets, Demarcus Robinson and Devin Duvernay going up against the Denver Broncos, and then finally, Treylon Burks going up against the Philadelphia Eagles. Before we get into the tier list, though, projected shadow matchups like we always do. Eagles wide receiver A.J. Brown expected to be shadowed by Christian Fulton of the Tennessee Titans. Browns wide receiver Amari Cooper expected to be shadowed by Texans cornerback Derek Stingley Jr. if he does play. Again, dealing with that hamstring injury. We have yet to see whether he will be ruled in for this game. Wide receiver Devontae Adams of the Raiders is expected to be shadowed by Chargers cornerback Asante Samuel Jr. And finally, if Marshawn Lattimore of the Saints does play, been dealing with that abdomen injury since week 6, he is expected to shadow Mike Evans. Like always, you guys know that feud that those two have between each other. Bye weeks for this week happen to be the Arizona Cardinals and the Carolina Panthers. So guys like DJ Moore, DeAndre Hopkins, Marquise Brown, Rondale Moore, all those guys will not play in this week's games. But now we go on to the elite tier, my wide receivers 1 to 6 this week. Basically, the wide receiver ones that have that elite week winning type of upside, in my opinion. Elite guys you guys see on the screen: Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, and Amon-Ra St. Brown. But now let's start off with my wide receiver one overall in the week with Devontae Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders, set to play the Los Angeles Chargers at home. Raiders are 1-point home underdogs in this game, 50.5 set over under, with the over being hit at a 75% rate. And the Raiders host the Chargers this week, as I kind of outlined. And Devontae Adams, like I said, is set to break your fantasy football matchup in this game. As we know, Adams is basically matchup proof, but the main thing I'm excited about is that 50.5 over under set and 25-point implied total for the Raiders in this game. Since the Raiders bye week, Adams has averaged 21.7 PPR points per game and has commanded 11.5 targets per game, including games of 17 targets, 14 targets, 13 targets, 11 targets, and 9 targets. We expect the Raiders to put up points like I kind of mentioned, and as we've seen, the catalyst of a big Raiders offensive day is solely on the back of number 17, their superstar wide receiver. So I expect Devontae Adams to go absolutely bonkers in this game. If you have him, you already know you're going to start him. But if you're playing from maybe a DFS perspective, I do think that his ceiling may be just higher than any other wide receiver in football this week. Number 2 is Tyreek Hill, wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, traveling on the road to play the San Francisco 49ers. 49ers are 4-point home favorites in this game. 46.5 set over under, with the over being hit at a 79% rate. And another elite target earner, I kind of mentioned with Devontae Adams, he has that ability to command volume when he's on the field. Tyreek Hill blends the ability to completely change the game on a single play with that game-breaking speed, agility, what he brings to the table with the ball in his hands. Combining that now this year with the type of volume he's been seeing with Mike McDaniel's system, he is on pace for over 1,900 yards receiving and has seen 8+ targets in all but 3 games this year. As good as the 49ers defense is, The way you need to beat them to have a chance is through the passing game. And Mike McDaniel has one of the best offensive schemes in the NFL in terms of isolating his best players into dangerous spots. The Dolphins are applied for about 21 points, which I get is not the greatest. But Tyreek Hill has the level of volume stability combined with that big play upside that make him a top 5 wide receiver every single week. 5 of his 11 games this year has totaled over 25 fantasy points. He is the definition of an elite baseline with that week winning level upside. So love Tyreek Hill, my wide receiver 2 this week. But now we move on to my wide receiver 4 because Stephon Diggs was my 3. He would have played last night. My wide receiver 4 this week is going to be Justin Jefferson, wide receiver of the Minnesota Vikings, going to play the New York Jets at home. 3-point home favorites, 44.5 set over under, with the over being hit at a 99% rate. And when it comes to Justin Jefferson, 10.55 targets per game, 22.3 fantasy points per game on the season. The only pause I have in comparison to the top 2 I mentioned is that with this New York Jets D, led by rookie cornerback Sauce Gardner, they are by far the hardest matchup for opposing wide receivers in the NFL. You got guys like Sauce Gardner on the back end, like I mentioned, DJ Reed really ascending into stars this season. So Jefferson is good enough to just flat out win his matchups. But the Jets do have the recipe to be able to cause havoc on Kirk Cousins and this Vikings offense. You know, that elite secondary, a stout front led by Quinnen Williams in a huge game. I wouldn't be shocked if this developed into a similar type of offensive struggle like the team faced against the Cowboys and the Eagles, but the team is still at home, still implied 24 points. So Vegas does expect them to keep humming, but there's still obviously that evident downside risk if things were to go south quick for the Minnesota Vikings offense. But again, you're never considering not putting Justin Jefferson in your top 5 wide receiver rankings in any given week. He's too good. The volume is too good. And the ceiling, I mean, 6 games of 25 plus fantasy points, including 4 games of 30 plus. He is the definition of elite, a top 2 talent, in my opinion, at the wide receiver position in the entire NFL. My wide receiver 5 this week is going to be CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver of the Dallas Cowboys, going to play the Indianapolis Colts at home, 10.5-point home favorites, 44.5 set over under, with the over being hit at a 93% rate. And he's next up. He's ready to build off that impressive performance he had on Thanksgiving against the New York Giants this past week. He's averaged 18.92 PPR points per game since Dak Prescott has returned to the lineup in week 7. He's truly ascended into that number 1 alpha wide receiver we were hoping for when we drafted him in the second round of our fantasy drafts. Now the Cowboys enter a matchup against an overmatched Colts team and are implied for 27.5 team offensive points in this game. I get it. The matchup is relatively tough on paper, like you guys would see from the matchup chart. But as I said, the Cowboys offense ranks number 1 since Dak Prescott has been under center and averages over 30 points per game since week 7. I think the offense just has really shown up for your fantasy teams in recent weeks. My wide receiver 6 of the week is going to be Amon St. Brown, wide receiver of the Detroit Lions, going to play the Jacksonville Jaguars at home. 1-point home favorites when it comes to the Lions, 51 set over under, with the over being hit at a 65% rate. And Monner just needs that respect as an elite fantasy wide receiver. In games that he's played over 50% of the snaps this year, St. Brown has target totals of 12, 12, 9, 10, 9, 11, 8, and 10. And potentially the highest scoring game of the week. The Lions are implied for 26 points, and the Jaguars present a top 5 matchup in terms of against opposing wide receivers when it comes to Amon St. Brown. I expect an absolute blow-up week from Amon this week, and more evidence killing that narrative that St. Brown isn't an elite wide receiver, because he absolutely is, in my opinion. So those are my top 6. Those are the elite guys from a fantasy football perspective this week. Now we get on to the wide receiver 1 tier, the guys 7 to 12 in my rankings, where I still like them. They're still stud wide receiver 1s, but I don't think they have that projectable upside. Rather it's circumstance, rather it's game environment, and you name it, compared to the top 6 guys on my week. We go on to A.J. Brown, wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles, cracking my wide receiver 7 spot, going to play the Tennessee Titans at home. 4.5-point home favorites when it comes to Philadelphia, 44 set over under, with the under being hit at a 56% rate. And A.J. Brown has all the ability in the world to completely go off, but the recent volume has me a bit concerned. Only 23 targets in his last 4 games after that monster Week 8 performance against Pittsburgh. He's looked just evidently banged up in recent weeks. 15.82 PPR points per game on the season, with highlight weeks, as I kind of mentioned, including 25.5 point and 39.6 point blowups. Very favorable matchup against the Titans this week, so we'll see if the Eagles can open back their passing offense. Either way, though, as we know, Brown has that elite talent with elite boom ceiling in his range of outcomes. The problem affecting that range of outcomes, in my opinion, though, is volume. If the Eagles do open up their offense, if they do start passing the ball more, I do think A.J. Brown could get right back into that fringe top 5 level status. Wide receiver 8 this week is going to be Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals, going to play the Kansas City Chiefs at home. They are 2-point implied home underdogs, 53-point over-under, with the over being hit at a 79% rate. And now we get to the guy that if I knew was going to see a full allotment of snaps and had no issues in terms of potential rust/timing, he would be a clear tier 1 top 5 level guy for me. I mean, when it comes to Jamar Chase, in his 7 games played prior to that hip injury that has held him out, he was averaging 10.6 targets per game, over 20 PPR points per game, and 3 weeks north of 25 PPR points, and 2 games of 30 plus points. Now in the matchup, again, as I kind of said, with the highest over-under on the entire slate, Cincinnati has an implied 25.5 team total, and all the peripherals point to a recipe for Chase to blow up against the same team he embarrassed last year with an 11 reception, 266-yard, and 3 touchdown line in their game last year. Again, if you have Jamar Chase, you are clearly firing him up, but you have to understand the certain level of risk that does exist with these snaps if they are limited in this game. I think he's going to get the full allotment, but we have yet to see it, so temper your expectations just a slight tad. Next wide receiver is Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins, going to play the San Francisco 49ers on the road. Again, as I kind of said with Tyreek Hill, San Francisco 4-point home favorites, 46.5 set over under, with the over being hit at a 79% rate. And copy and paste that exact same situational case that I made for Tyreek Hill with Jalen Waddle, considering Jalen Waddle is just basically the B version and interchangeable when it comes to Tyreek Hill in this offense. I expect the Dolphins, despite that tough matchup, to be able to score and move the ball. And Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill are going to be the catalyst if they're able to do so. While not on a Tyreek Hill volume level, Waddle still averages 7.73 targets per game and 17.1 PPR points per game this season. You are starting him each and every week with wide receiver 1 expectations. Wide receiver 10 on the week is going to be Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns, going to play the Houston Texans on the road. 7-point home underdogs when it comes to Houston. 47.5 set over under, with the over being hit at an 80% rate. And Amari Cooper, welcome to the wide receiver 1 ranks. He averages over 16 PPR points per game on the season, despite Jacoby Brissett being his signal caller all year. And now he gets Browns starter Deshaun Watson back for his first game as a Cleveland Brown, a revenge game against his former club with the Houston Texans. Cooper has already showed that level of dependability in your fantasy lineups, but now he has a legit top 10 quarterback in the NFL back to raise that upside even higher. In a game where the Browns are implied for a whopping 27 points with Watson back, they are 7-point home favorites against a very favorable matchup with the Texans. With Deshaun Watson back, 7-point favorites in a very favorable matchup versus the Texans, who may be potentially without their number 1 corner, Derek Stingley. You have to respect Amari Cooper, top 10 level wide receiver for me this week. Next up in my wide receiver 11 is going to be T. Higgins, wide receiver of the Cincinnati Bengals. Mentioned it exactly with Jamar Chase. Cincinnati is 2-point home underdogs in this game. 53 set over under, with the over being hit at a 79% rate. Like I said, T. Higgins, in the absence of Jamar Chase since week 7, really proved himself to be a capable number 1 wide receiver. He averaged 18.8 points per game in those 4 games. However, even with Jamar Chase on the field, he is still a great fantasy wide receiver, and I expect a boatload of points to be scored in this game. I expect the passing offenses on both sides to be humming, and for this matchup to live up to expectations. So if you have T. Higgins, wide receiver 1 level expectations for him. And then finally, closing off my wide receiver 1s is Chris Godwin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, going to play the New Orleans Saints at home on Monday Night Football. 3.5-point home favorites when it comes to Tampa Bay. 40.5 set over under, with the under being hit at a 60% rate. And this always profiles as that gritty divisional slugfest. But with Chris Godwin, he's been the model of consistency as a fantasy wide receiver too this year. He's fully recovering from last year's late season ACL tear. He's posted 8+ targets in all but 1 game since week 4, and he averages 15.6 PPR points per game in that stretch, despite only 2 touchdowns scored. Those 2 touchdowns, though, have come in the last 2 weeks, and recently as a whole, the Bucs offense has really taken a step up. The matchup peripherals, I get it, are not great. 40.5 set over under is kind of low. 22-point implied team total is, decent, but Godwin's volume alone is enough to make him viable, and his talent and recent play indicate that he could ascend into that weekly wide receiver 1 territory if he keeps this pace up. So absolutely love Chris Godwin. You guys would see those are my wide receiver 1s this week. Now we go to my wide receiver 2s, and leading that list off is DK Metcalf at number 13 of the Seattle Seahawks, going on the road to play the Los Angeles Rams, another interdivisional matchup. 7-point home underdogs when it comes to LA. 40.5 set over under, with the under being hit at a 68% rate. And when it comes to DK Metcalf, we all know that he has that wide receiver 1 level talent. But in this situation with this game expected to be such a low scoring affair against the Los Angeles Rams, but again, 40.5 set over under, 68% under rate when it comes to the sharps. This indicates it's going to be a low scoring affair between these two teams. Metcalf on the season is averaging 13.3 PPR points per game game, but he has picked it up in his last 4 games after coming back from the injury. 16.4 PPR points per game in that stretch and scored 2 of his 4 seasonal touchdowns. The problem that I have with him right now is that he hasn't held that same efficiency as he's had in recent years, and the touchdowns haven't held up to his high standard from recent years. Again, I still think he's a very dependable wide receiver 2 in each week, but not sure he has that same week winning upside that he's had in previous years. A prerequisite, in my opinion, towards those wide receiver ones, towards those elite guys I have in my rankings in this week. So love DK Metcalf, top 15 wide receiver for me, but barely misses out on that top 12 coveted wide receiver 1 range. Next up is Keenan Allen, wide receiver, the LA Chargers, going to crack my wide receiver 14. Going to play the Las Vegas Raiders on the road, like I mentioned earlier on with Devontae Adams. 1-point home favorites when it comes to the Las Vegas Raiders. 50.5 set over under, with the over being hit at a 75% rate. And this may seem low for Keenan Allen once we're granted hindsight. A 50.5 set over under is absolutely massive. And with the Sharps hammering the over at the rate they are indicating a heavy betting expectation for a shootout. And given this Raiders defense being the 3rd easiest matchup for opposing wide receivers, I expect it to be the same as well. Keenan Allen, he's been fine since recovering from his injury. He's provided that steady baseline with 8 targets and 7 targets respectively in the last 2 weeks. And he's averaged 14.15 PPR points per game in the last 2. And I do think that this is a bounce back spot, but compared to the guys that are above him, he just simply lacks that elite efficiency volume thus far that I have seen from other guys above him. Again, I still think this is the get right spot. I still think he could potentially rejoin that wide receiver 1 status, but you'll deal with high-end wide receiver 2. Still a really good play this week, especially against that banged-up Las Vegas secondary. Wide receiver 15 this week's going to be Terry McLaurin, wide receiver of the Washington Commanders, going on the road to play the New York Giants. 2.5-point home underdogs when it comes to New York. 40 set over-under, with the under being hit at a 98% rate. And Terry McLaurin's been on fire since Taylor Heineke took over at quarterback. 8.2 targets per game. 14.2 PPR points per game since. He now faces that banged-up Giants secondary that's going to be without Xavier McKinney and Adoree Jackson. He's still an elite talent, solid volume. Quarterback situation with Heineke does hurt the ceiling, but I do think he's good enough to the point where it hasn't really mattered much. He's got that steady floor with his ability to be able to command targets. Wide receiver 16 this week is going to be Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars, going on the road to play the Detroit Lions. The Lions are 1-point home favorites, like I said, with the Monra. 51 set over under, with the over being hit at a 65% rate. And you can argue with Christian Kirk being higher. Second easiest matchup on the matchup chart, 51 over under. We expect this to be a very high scoring affair. And given the recent play of franchise quarterback Trevor Lawrence, Kirk has the opportunity to crack that wide receiver 1 territory if this offense maintains its potency from recent weeks. He had his ups and downs this season, but with his command over this Jags receiving core, 8.3 targets per game, along with the peripherals, 16 in my rankings may even be low. Expect him to continue producing this week in what's been a breakout season when it comes to Kirk. Wide receiver 17 is Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks, going on the road like DK Metcalf to play the Los Angeles Rams. 7-point home underdogs for the Rams, 40.5 set over unders. And the Sharps are hammering the under at a 68% rate. And for the most part, this has been, an uncharacteristic season for Tyler Lockett. He's produced 11.5 PPR points in 9 of his 11 games this year. He averages 14.53 PPR points per game on the season. You can really make the argument between him and DK. I do prefer DK, but I won't fault anybody for ranking Tyler Lockett higher. Again, overall, I think both have limited ceilings given their game environment. Floors are extremely high, as has been evident all year. Number 18, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets, traveling on the road to play the Minnesota Vikings. Vikings are 3-point home favorites, 44.5 set over under, with the over being hit, as I said, 99% rate. I get it. It's a bit of projection to have Garrett Wilson here, but I'm all in on Garrett Wilson potentially being this year's Amon St. Brown. In his last 4 games, Garrett Wilson is averaging 16.25 PPR points per game, despite dealing with that inconsistent quarterback play, and is coming off his second best game of the year, that 5-catch, 95-yard, 2-touchdown reception performance. And the offense has just simply looked much better with Mike White at the helm. The Vikings have the 4th easiest matchup against opposing wide receivers there. I do expect Garrett Wilson to continue last week's dominance and edge closer and closer to wide receiver 1 status. Similar to Garrett Wilson, his teammate in college, we go to wide receiver 19, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints, going on the road, like I said, to play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 3.5-point home favorites when it comes to Tampa, 40.5 set over under. They're being hit at a 60% rate. And Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson have really just been the most productive rookie wide receivers as a whole this season. So it's all too real that they're back-to-back for me. Olave plays that tough Tampa Bay defense, while, of course, as I said with Garrett Wilson, a lot softer of a matchup. But in terms of Olave, he has basically been matchup-proof this year, en route to a wide receiver 15 overall standing in fantasy thus far. 8.4 targets per game, 14.2 PPR points per game. He will consistently be a wide receiver 2 for me, regardless of matchup, due to that elite volume that he's been seeing with an empty list Saints wide receiver core. Wide receiver 20 on the week is going to be Mike Evans, wide receiver of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Again, going at home, New Orleans Saints, 3.5 point home favorites, 4.5 set under being hit 60% rate. But with Mike Evans, the potential hurdle that could be in his way is the status of Marshawn Lattimore. As we know, Marshawn Lattimore has been Mike Evans' boogeyman, Mike Evans' kryptonite throughout their careers, but he's been battling, like I said, that abdomen injury since week 6. I think even if he does play, he's sure to be in some pain with that abdomen injury. However, regardless of Lattimore's status, Evans is still averaging 13.9 PPR points per game on the season, 8.5 targets per game, which if you equated that to his full season output, 16, 17 games, would actually be his best seasonal pace since 2018. He's been uncharacteristically inefficient this year, which has hurt that bottom line when it comes to Mike Evans. But this is still one of the premier wide receiver talents in the NFL. We're just waiting on that touchdown outburst to come back. And in my opinion, he's a low-end wide receiver 2 for now without that famous touchdown upside, but he can easily jump back into the top 15, maybe even in the top 10 if the Bucs offense keeps regaining form. So those are my wide receiver 2s. Now let's head on to the wide receiver 2-3 fringe tier, wide receivers 21 to 30. And these guys and the guys after them, I'm going to try to keep more sped up. But we got on to wide receiver 21, Brandon Ayuk of the San Francisco 49ers, going to play the Miami Dolphins at home, 4-point home favorites, 46.5 set over being hit 79% rate. And Brandon Ayuk, 17.25 PPR points per game since week 6. This San Francisco offense has really clicked. As a result, Ayuk has thrived. The caveat here, of course, is the health status of Deebo Samuel. If he suits up, wide receiver 21 is a fine ranking for Ayuk, in my opinion. But if he's out, you can elevate Ayuk into that high-end wide receiver 2 status, in my opinion. Wide receiver 22 this week is going to be Christian Watson of the Green Bay Packers, going to play the Chicago Bears on the road, 3.5-point home underdogs when it comes to Chicago. 44.5 set over-under with the under being hit at a 65% rate. And Christian Watson, what can I say about him? 20 targets in his last 3 games, converting them into 265 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns. Over the last 3 games, he is the wide receiver 2 overall in fantasy. Only Devontae Adams. He's finding that rhythm with Aaron Rodgers, and Aaron Rodgers has finally trusted him as that clear alpha wide receiver 1 on his team, given that explosive downfield ability that he has portrayed. Now, again, going into a matchup against a Bears D that has looked like absolute Swiss cheese since trading Robert Quinn, since trading Roquan Smith, and now are without stud safety Eddie Jackson. Watson's going to continue to cook. I wouldn't be shocked if he enters that wide receiver 2 territory in my rankings soon enough. Wide receiver 23, Josh Palmer of the LA Chargers, going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. Raiders, 1-point home favorites, 50.5 set over being hit at a 75% rate. And despite holding that, boom bust moniker this past year, Palmer has averaged 16.8 PPR points per game since the team's bye week and is now in a matchup against that same Raiders secondary that I mentioned for Keenan Allen. He's just set to go ballistic. He's been really good matchup. Fire up Josh Palmer as a wide receiver 2-3 fringe type in your lineups this week. Wide receiver 24, Treylon Burks of the Tennessee Titans, going to play the Philadelphia Eagles on the road. Eagles are 4.5-point home favorites, 44 set over-under with the under being hit at a 56% rate. And Treylon Burks, 20 targets the last 3 games since returning from that injury that held him out. Back-to-back impressive performances from him. 18.1 PPR points 2 weeks ago, 17 PPR points from him last week. He finally looks to be breaking out after dealing with that toe injury that sidelined him for a few weeks. He's a wide receiver 3 for me as of now with that wide receiver 2+ upside if he continues this level of dominance. Wide receiver 25 is Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts, going on the road to play the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys are 10.5-point home favorites, 4.5 set over-under with the over being hit at a 93% rate. And Michael Pittman, wide receiver 14 on the season, but he has been a bit rocky since week 7, where he's averaged only 12 PPR points per game and only has 1 touchdown in that stretch. I don't think he's a very good player, but the volume has been very inefficient, and the quarterback play, for the most part, has been extremely volatile with Matt Ryan and Sam Ehlinger at the helm. The 4th toughest matchup against opposing wide receivers this week. That consistent pressure coming to Matt Ryan all game, in my opinion. I'm really worried about just how high a ceiling Pittman really holds against the Dallas Cowboys this week. Wide receiver 26 would have been Gabe Davis, but he already played on Thursday Night Football. So now we head on to wide receiver 27, George Pickens of the Pittsburgh Steelers, on the road, Atlanta Falcons. Falcons are 1-point home underdogs in this game. 42 set over-under with the over being hit at a 99% rate. And despite a low target share, George Pickens has shown that he has that knack for big plays. He's as volatile as a wide receiver gets, but 14.5 PPR points per game in his last 3 games since their bye week, and a potential growing role that we see from him could potentially leave him in that wide receiver 2 territory soon enough. Not to mention an oncoming matchup against the single worst defense against opposing wide receivers. If you have George Pickens, fire him up and enjoy if this is indeed his his breakout week. Wide receiver 28 this week is going to be Juju Smith-Schuster of the Kansas City Chiefs, traveling on the road to play the Cincinnati Bengals. Bengals are 2-point home underdogs in this game. 53 set over-under, with the over being hit at a 79% rate. And when it comes to Juju Smith-Schuster, we obviously saw this past week, he wants to build off of that slow game he had first game back after suffering that concussion that sidelined him. The peripherals are clearly there, as I kind of said. High-scoring affair, Kansas City juggernaut offense, but I'm just a little bit worried at what exactly his role is going to be in this game. As I said, it's very limited in his first game back. While you'd assume that he'd be fully back to his normal route participation this week, it's still an assumption in my opinion. I think he's earned that status of being a top 24 wide receiver when he's fully healthy, but I'll slightly limit my expectations just a tad until that usage returns. Again, a lot of boom upside this week. Great matchup. Just worried about that usage when it comes to Juju. Wide receiver 29 is going to be Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, traveling on the road to play the Baltimore Ravens. Ravens are 8.5-point home favorites in this game. 39.5 set over under, with the under being hit at an 83% rate. And Sutton has been one of the more predictable wide receivers of the season, in my opinion. When Jerry Jeudy has played, he's been rendered as a wide receiver 4 with that target competition, but thrives when Jerry Jeudy is out of the lineup. And I think you can argue him being higher because of this trend. In my opinion, he's clearly a wide receiver 2-3 fringe type. Each week Jeudy is out. 26 targets in his last 3 games, which gives him that steady floor. My problem is just with how anemic the passing offense has been. Baltimore obviously represents a favorable matchup, which gives the pro side of the Sutton coin more merit, but he's still volatile because I'm not sure just how well the Broncos offense is going to be able to move the ball against anyone at this point. It is that anemic. It can't move the ball, can't score points, which is severely going to limit Courtland Sutton's upside, but the volume floor gives him enough to be a top 30 wide receiver. And finally, my wide receiver 30 would have been Jacoby Myers, but as we know, already played on Thursday Night Football. Now let's rapid fire the wide receivers 31 to 40. Don't want to make this too long. Deontay Johnson, wide receiver of the Pittsburgh Steelers, on the road, Atlanta Falcons. Falcons 1-point underdogs, 42 set over being hit 99% rate. When it comes to Deontay Johnson, simply, he has not scored over 11 PPR points since week 3. You heard that right. With his target share, with the raw targets he's been seeing, 11 PPR points has not crossed since week 3. Very, very concerning when it comes to that trend. When it comes to Deontay Johnson, I just kind of frame him as that unrealized target share king. And saying Deontay Johnson has been a disappointment this year is an absolute understatement. He is the inverse situation to Pickens. Obviously, with Pickens getting those valuable touches, bait at less volume. But with Deontay Johnson, he gets a ton of volume, but the majority of them are those muddied down, invaluable looks when it comes to this offense. He needs to play better, and he needs this offense to move the ball more consistently for me to have him back in that wide receiver 2 land, even in a great matchup against the Atlanta Falcons this week. Receiver 32 on the week is Allen Lazard of the Green Bay Packers, traveling on the road like his teammate Christian Watson to play the Chicago Bears. Bears, 3.5-point home underdogs, 44.5 set under being hit 65% rate. And with Allen Lazard, he's the wide receiver 32 on the season and has been a fine flex. But with the emergence of Christian Watson, it limits his upside severely, in my opinion. Again, still great matchup, solid range of outcomes, and a Packers offense that has played much better ball as of late. I still like Allen Lazard in my wide receiver 3 territory. Next up, wide receiver 33 is Adam Thielen of the Minnesota Vikings, going to play the New York Jets at home. 3-point home favorites, 44.5 set over being hit 99% rate. Adam Thielen, the wide receiver 28 on the season. But he's been very up and down to get there thus far. Only 11.75 PPR points per game. 4 games with single digits in scoring versus double digits. So clearly he's got that boom bust nature. If he crosses over 10 points, he's going to give you a nice performance. But realistically, those performances thus far have been scarce. And not to mention, the matchup is tough. My only saving grace with Thielen, though, is that he's produced in a tough matchup this past week against the Patriots. And the volume on a good offense has at least been there. He's a volatile wide receiver 3. The outlook is a little bit muddy, but at this range of wide receiver, that's the best you're going to get. Wide receiver 34 is Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, going to play the Pittsburgh Steelers at home. 1-point home underdog, 42 set over being hit at a 99% rate. And I don't want to do this story with Drake London every single week, but gosh, can we just get him the ball, Atlanta? The talent is clearly there. We have a positive game environment against Pittsburgh, but the Falcons need to get the ball in their hands of their number 1 playmaker on offense. The floor is just extremely low given Arthur Smith's tendencies. The volume does go back up to early season levels. London can be a legit top 25 wide receiver again, but until then, wide receiver 3, low-end flex range when it comes to Drake London. Want that upside to materialize, but I have to see it before I believe it. Number 35, Donovan Peoples-Jones of the Cleveland Browns, traveling on the road to play the Houston Texans. Texans, 7-point home underdogs, 47.5 set over being hit 80% rate. With Donovan Peoples-Jones, obviously, as I mentioned with Amari Cooper, Watson is finally returning. He's played great in recent weeks, and this is a prime environment given the implied team total and the strength of their opponent when it comes to Cleveland Browns. I expect Amari Cooper, of course, to be that alpha wide receiver, but with David Njoku already ruled out for this week's game, I'm looking for Donovan Peoples-Jones to build on that impressive resume he has shown thus far. Receiver 36 is Darius Slayton of the New York Giants, going to play the Washington Commanders at home. Half-point home underdogs when it comes to New York. 40 set over-under, being hit at a 98% rate. And when it comes to Slayton, as I kind of said, 20 targets in his last 3 games. And when it comes to Darius Slayton, he has been the Giants' de facto wide receiver 1 and has looked good as of late. Saw him get 20 targets in the last 3 games. Darius Slayton has all the opportunity in the world to continue building off of that impressive stretch he's shown thus far. Relatively tough matchup against Washington, game environment and expected point total, but the usage alone, I think, makes him worth a top 40 ranking. Wide receiver 37, Tyler Boyd of the Cincinnati Bengals. 2-point home underdogs when it comes to Cincinnati, 53 set over being hit at a 79% rate. And with Tyler Boyd, phenomenal game environment, elite offense when it comes to Cincinnati. Now, as I said, Jamar Chase does come back to make that offense even more potent. I really like Boyd to bounce back a few disappointing performances in a row. Wide receiver 38, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans, going to play the Cleveland Browns at home. 7-point home underdogs, 47.5 set over being hit at an 80% rate. And Nico Collins, 26 targets in his last 3 games. The usage has been phenomenal. This is potentially missing this game, as I'll get into. Collins could have even more of a rise if he keeps impressing. Wide receiver 39 is going to be Michael Gallup of my Dallas Cowboys. Again, Indianapolis at home. Half-point home favorites, 44.5 set over being hit at a 93% rate. And Michael Gallup this past week, 27% target share, 5-catch, 63-yard line on 8 targets. This was his best game of the season, and he's finally looking like himself again. And the Cowboys offense has been the #1 unit in the NFL, as I mentioned, with CD since Dak's return. I expect him to continue building off of that semi-breakout bounce back that we saw. He's the big play threat of this offense. Excellent high pointing on the boundary. 27.5 implied points for Dallas. Michael Gallup is a big threat to score in this game. And then finally, tailing off this list, wide receiver 40 is Matt Collins of the Las Vegas Raiders, going to play the Los Angeles Chargers at home. Home underdogs in this game for Las Vegas, 50.5 set over with the over being hit at a 75% rate. And this is a very positive game environment, like I mentioned, for Devontae Adams. Matt Collins has been a double-digit scorer in 3 of his last 5 games, and I get it, he is volatile, but at this point in the rankings, wide receiver 40, who isn't volatile? But either way, those are my top 40 wide receivers. A couple guys you might be wondering, well, how are they not in your rankings? There are a couple guys listed here that I do have as will they play. Not necessarily certain of their status thus far. Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers hasn't really practiced this week. Doesn't really look like he's going to play, but if he does play, wide receiver 2 level expectation. Devontae Smith, wide receiver of the Philadelphia Eagles, also questionable going into this matchup. If he does play, he'll be in that wide receiver 2-3 fringe range for me. Jones, wide receiver of the Jacksonville Jaguars, he would be a firm wide receiver 3 for me if he does suit up in this game. Brandon Cooks, wide receiver of the Houston Texans, again, firm wide receiver 3 for me if he does play in this game. And then finally, Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos. Very unlikely he does play, but if he does, going to be in that wide receiver 25 to 30 range of my rankings. But either way, if you enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. Again, 150 like goal on this video. A little longer than I wanted to make it, but at the end of the day, trying to get that information out to you. And of course, subscribe to the channel. We're on the road to 20,000 subscribers as always. Appreciate you guys for that continued support. Leave down below your biggest start-sit decisions. I will try to answer as many as possible. But until then, good luck in your matchups. Take care.
Wire me the money.